Chapter 3 The Long Ago. Hilda was meditating over the road she had chosen. The child lay near her asleep, its tiny chest heaving up and down with rhythmic succession. Through the faded, pale blue blanket in which it was wrapped, life was beating. The infant, not yet 2 days old, was carrying on a struggle for existence. She tried to visualize the road before them, but could not follow it. It seemed to be running on endlessly. She bent over to the pink little face and felt the child's breath on her lips. "Baby," she whispered. "Sweetheart, Raymond." She stopped short as if trying to arrest the word she had spoken, to retract it. But in the next breath she yielded. Raymond. She had called him, and Raymond let the child's name be. Yes, Raymond. She was staring straight ahead with unseeing eyes. She had always thought it distinguished for father and son to have the same name and to be differentiated only by the words senior and junior at the end. Raymond Everett, Jr., she repeated faintly. She had once dreamed of it, but she took off the thought as one shakes off a fly. No, that would not be the case with her son. More than Raymond, she would not take from his father's name. The family name would be hers. It would be Thorson, Raymond Thorson. Her thoughts turned upon herself. She was wondering at the calmness with which she was thinking these things. She was acting as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if she were a regular mother, had a husband waiting to welcome her, a home to come to, instead of going out into a hostile world. Did she realize what she was doing, what was ahead of her? She was parting forever from her old life, from her old self. She had assumed the role of a widow as an expedient to escape the shame and ostracism which her condition would otherwise entail. And now she would have to wear the mask forever, wear it and live up to it. There was a pounding of horses' hoofs on the pavement in the street below, and this sharpened her hearing. Noises which she had failed to take notice of for the past few days now became distinguishable. The rumbling of the elevated trains, the buzzsaw-like sound from a nearby factory, the shrieking of the sirens from the boats in the East River, all came to her now with acute sharpness. The city of 4 millions was speaking, and it was speaking depressingly. She recalled how 7 months earlier she had dragged herself from factory to factory looking for work. The same weary trudging awaited her now. It would be repeated at regular intervals for years, all her life. She would be an old woman by the time her son was grown. Yes, yes. She seemed to be rebuking someone impatiently. She was aware of these things. She knew what awaited her. But she did not care to think. Now, she had been thinking too much already. She was tired. She wanted to rest, to let her mind rest. It was good to rest, especially with the child lying near her as it was now, the warmth from its little body radiating toward her. One after another, the factory whistles were shrieking the announcement that the day's toil was over, and the faces of the women in the ward with Hilda became eager with expectation. It was visitors' night. There was a hasty attention to appearance, a final pat of the hair, a straightening out of kimonos, a tugging at nightgowns. In the absence of mirrors, women were examining their hands, and by the appearance of their hands, tried to judge what the color of their faces might be. Supper was eaten in haste, and then for about 10 minutes there was a silence in the room such as comes sometimes on the eve of a solemn event. Promptly at 11 o'clock, the visitors began to arrive. The Swan Maternity was located on the Upper East Side of New York, hard by the East River. It was a most cosmopolitan district, the newcomers from all the countries of Europe living there. The foreign aspect of her surroundings impressed themselves upon Hilda with the entrance of the first visitor. He was a tall Hungarian laborer with a weather-beaten face and black bristling mustache. He walked on tiptoe, and this only heightened the impression of pent-up energy in the man. The Hungarian apparently was having difficulty in recognizing his wife, the hospital beds making all patients look alike from a distance. He stopped, bewildered, but finally caught sight of a hand beckoning to him from the further end of the room. He recognized his wife, uttered a suppressed "ah," and started toward her. When he reached her side, however, the Hungarian was visibly embarrassed. He was the only man in the ward, and he did not know how to act. All eyes were fixed upon him, and he swayed from foot to foot for some moments. His wife finally came to his relief by motioning to him to sit down beside her on the bed. A huge Irishman in the 40s, who had the appearance of a doorman in an aristocratic club, came next. He was pompous and stiff, and the glance and greeting he and his wife exchanged were so strained and casual that, had he not just entered, they might easily have given the appearance that the two had been quarreling. 2 Italian women followed. A young Pole, smelling strongly of cheap perfume, was next, and finally a young man of distinguished appearance entered. The latter made his way to the bed which stood next to Hilda's. Late that afternoon, Hilda had for the first time gathered sufficient interest to look over to the young woman who lay in the adjoining bed. From conversation which her neighbor had had with the nurse, Hilda gathered that it was her second baby. The distinguished-looking man was the only one to bring flowers to his wife. The rest brought things to eat, mostly cake and fruit. The Pole, who was expecting his wife to go home in a few days, in addition brought her a kimono. It was a loud $1.25 affair, but it seemed to give his wife, who looked to be only 18 or 19 years of age, no end of pleasure. She gazed at it with rapturous eyes, as if it were a fairy mantle. The men were taken one by one into the nursery to see the children. They came back with shining eyes, their stiffness and embarrassment gone. The room now resounded with eagerly whispered conversation. As the visiting hour drew to a close, there was added to the whispered conversation a soft kissing. The distinguished-looking man at Hilda's right was talking to his wife in a foreign language. She answered him in that language, but just as often she would say something to him in English. She spoke it as one born to it. Her husband, on the other hand, spoke with an accent. But his accent was not irritating. It was not the accent of the alien laborer in the street. There was an air of refinement about it. Lydia, the man called his wife, pronouncing every syllable separately. She called him Ernest. He was kissing her arm. His head was inclining more and more toward his wife's face. Hilda pulled the blanket tighter about her shoulder and turned her head away from them. She was the only one in the room to have no visitors, and as the men were leaving, She felt the eyes of the women turning searchingly toward her. She was different. They all felt that she was different. Yes, it would not be the only time eyes would turn to her questioningly, and it would not be alone the eyes of strangers. After some years, when he was old enough to understand, to feel the absence of a father, her son too would question her. It was easy to lie to the world, nor did it matter much whether the world fully believed the lie or not, so long as it left her alone. But it would matter with the child. What would she tell him? The distinguished-looking man was the last to go and was taking leave of his wife. The sound of his voice stirred within Hilda a faint memory. Her father, she recalled, spoke at times with an accent not unlike that of the man. Dim shadows of her childhood rose before her eyes, shadows of mother, father, of the house they lived in, and the house across the road where Raymond and his people, the Everts, lived. At the thought of Raymond, she instinctively drew back. She did not want him linked with her memories just then. There would be time to think about him later. Now she wanted to think of her home. Before she was aware of it, however, Raymond had become the pivot about which all her memories were turning. Hilda's memory of Raymond Everett went back to the days when they both wore rompers and played in the sand. She was somewhere between 3 and 4 years old. Raymond was a year older. In the course of an afternoon, Hilda's mother would call the two into the kitchen and give each a piece of bread and butter or syrup. Sometimes Raymond's mother would do this. The Everett and the Thorson families lived across the road from each other a short ways beyond the city limits of Stillwell, Wisconsin. The heads of the families engaged in the same business, which was that of supplying the city of Stillwell with sand for its constantly rising buildings. Henry Everett, Raymond's father, and Hilda's father, Carl Thorson, each owned a sandpit from which he drew his daily bread in the shape of so many wagon loads of sand. There, however, the similarity between the two men and their families ended. Henry Everett was a tall, well-built man, full of vitality and energy. He was a figure in local politics, received much mail, and paid frequent visits to the city hall and the courthouse. He had 6 teams going, but it was only on very rare occasions that he himself took a load of sand to the city. His hired men did this. Hilda's father was 8 years younger than his neighbor, but he carried himself as a much older man would. There was no sparkle in him. He was quiet at all times. Carl Thorson, too, was getting only the odds and ends of the sand business in Stillwell. Whenever Hilda recalled her father, she ascribed the mute sadness which seldom left him to her mother's condition. As far back as she could remember, her mother, Selma Thorson, had always been ailing. She always seemed as if she were getting ready to take a long journey. Henry Everett was acting neither fair nor neighborly toward Carl Thorson. He was frequently taking his hired men away from the latter and was overlapping on his business otherwise. Every time, however, that Carl Thorson was about to have it out with his neighbor, his wife would dissuade him. Mrs. Thorson fully understood the nature of her sickness. She knew far earlier than her husband what was in store for her, and she wanted peace for herself and playmates for little Hilda. Hilda was an only child, while in the Everett family there were 5 children. The Everett children, and more especially Raymond, the youngest, was Hilda's playmate. Until she was 6 years old, her mother was on her feet. But no sooner had she started school than Mrs. Thorson took to her room. Upon coming home from school, Hilda would frequently find her mother lying on the bed. Mrs. Thorson was very tender with her now, but she would not let little Hilda come too near her, and would send her more and more frequently to the Everts to play with little Raymond. When Hilda was 8 years old, her mother died, and within a year her father had remarried. It was an indifferent marriage. The woman, a Mrs. Shannon, was a widow in the neighborhood and had 4 children, all boys, by her first marriage. The Thorson home now resounded with cries and fights from early morning until night. Her father was more subdued than ever. Between Hilda and her stepbrothers, and through them with her stepmother, bad blood was arising. While the clouds were thickening over the Thorson household, the sun was shining for the Everett family. Henry Everett had gone into the cement business. Weekly and sometimes twice a week, he would now go to Chicago, which was 3 hours' run from Stillwell. Once Raymond brought the news to Hilda that his people were planning to move to Chicago. She was miserable for days after. It was shortly after Raymond and Hilda had both graduated from the public school that the Everett house across the road, to which Hilda had looked up all her life as to a fountain of cheer, remained standing one afternoon, stripped and hollow. The Everetts had gone to Chicago. The house now reminded Hilda of a corpse from which all life was gone, and for some time she avoided looking at it. It was about this time, too, that Hilda's father began going to the doctor. 2 years passed. Carl Thorson was going to the doctor with greater frequency. One day he had a long consultation with his wife, the upshot of which was that the following week a nephew of hers, George Reynolds, came to live with them and took much of the business off Carl Thorson's hands. When Hilda saw her father sitting in front of the house one afternoon shortly after the new arrangement, she could not speak from fright. He had a look not unlike that her mother had had a year or two before her death, and he spoke to her with the same caressing gentleness with which her mother was wont to speak to her. Despite her 16 years, Hilda could not get up courage to talk to her father about his condition. Her face would start to burn with shame every time she wanted to ask him how he was. Finally, he broached the subject himself. His chest was troubling him, he told her, but a good rest would set him right again. The doctor said so. Carl Thorson was smiling to his daughter as he spoke, but Hilda turned and fled into the house. She ran upstairs into her own room, where she lay upon the bed and wept for a long time. It was the first great sorrow she had known. She was in her 17th summer when her father, late one afternoon, asked her to take a stroll with him. Slowly he labored his way up the road almost a quarter of a mile beyond the house. There they sat down under a tree. He talked with her briefly about her mother and himself. They had come from Denmark when both were quite young. He had worked on a farm, and her mother, Selma Cavling, worked for the family adjoining this place. Later, he went to the city, and when he managed to establish himself in the sand business, he and Selma married. Of her mother's family, he knew little. She was early left an orphan. She had older brothers in Denmark, but they had never corresponded. As for himself, he had a brother in Chicago, Martin Thorson. He produced a piece of paper upon which his brother's address was scribbled and gave it to Hilda. His brother, he explained, had been a porter in a hotel several years earlier. What he was doing then, Carl Thorson did not know, but he advised Hilda to keep the address. She might someday want to go to her uncle. Blood was thicker than water. She helped him get home, biting her lips and speaking not at all till they reached the house. Her father went to bed immediately. The walk had exhausted him. Hilda, having cleared the table from the supper and washed the dishes, went up to her room and opened an old family trunk, which had once belonged to her mother, and in which, upon her mother's death, Carl Thorson had stuck away the things his wife had worn, together with an old album and some letters, his and his wife's. She now went over these things one by one, and they assumed a new significance for her. He died in October. The day of the funeral, it rained miserably, and it was expedited with great haste. She stayed through the winter at home, with the snow lying up on the fields several feet thick and blizzards rattling against the windows. She had not the courage to think of Chicago. But when spring came, the snow melted, and the elements lost their sinister and menacing aspect, thoughts of Chicago began weaving themselves in her mind. She had become completely estranged from her stepmother during the winter months. Mrs. Thorson was quarreling with Hilda less, but it was this that heightened the feeling of estrangement between them. They were nothing to each other now. Carl Thorson, the father and husband, who was the link between them, was dead, and Hilda felt that it was time for her to leave. So she wrote to her uncle in Chicago. The reply came quickly. Hilda stayed about the house another week before taking leave of it. She felt that once she left the place, she probably would never see it again. She left Stillwell early on a Friday morning and reached Chicago at noon. The following Monday, she had without trouble found work in a factory. It was 2 years later that she and her childhood playmate, Raymond Everett, accidentally met. Just before she fell asleep that night, Hilda went back to her memories. But it was not home and parents. She was thinking of. It was Pearl Whitney and her son Walter. The memory of Pearl and of Walter had been haunting Hilda since that morning in September, when the first terrifying suspicion came to her that all was not well with her. Pearl Whitney had occupied a forlorn-looking cottage on the outskirts of Stillwell. By straining her memory, Hilda could recall the funeral of Silas Whitney, Pearl's father. In the years that followed his death, Silas Whitney, who had been a modest carpenter all his life, had become a legendary figure. People spoke of him as being a very upright and very honorable man. The upright and honorable were stressed every time his name was mentioned. And mentioned his name was frequently, much more frequently than that of any other departed member of the immediate neighborhood. The reason for this frequent mention was his daughter Pearl and her boy Walter. Walter was an illegitimate child and was the black sheep of the community. Though Silas Whitney had lived to a good old age, people swore that it was disgrace that killed him, the disgrace his daughter brought upon him. After their father's death, his other children had moved from Stillwell one by one, leaving Pearl and Walter to shift as best they might by themselves. And shifting had not been easy for Pearl nor for her son. Every morning when the men were going to the city to work, the lanky figure of Pearl Whitney was seen among them. She too was going to work. She was washing and scrubbing for a living. And she would not come home much ahead of the men either. In the many years which Hilda had known her, she had never seen Pearl look anyone straight in the face. Her eyes were always directed away from the person she was speaking to. Pearl Whitney was still on this side of 30 when Hilda was quite a girl, but never had Hilda seen a smile on her face, nor had she ever seen her speak to a man. When not out working, she was in the house. She was living like a hermit. Pearl's son Walter, on the other hand, was seen everywhere. He was bright in school, but was considered bad and irregular. The teachers would let him alone. He could do almost anything no other boy would be permitted to do, and there would be no one to say a word to him. In school proper, all the boys would play with Walter. They were afraid to turn him away, for he was a fighter and could be mean. But no boy would invite him to his house to play, and on Saturdays, Walter would run about the streets and pick up company among older boys. On Sundays, however, when the neighborhood blacksmith shop, the feed store, and the meat market, which were his principal hangouts on days when there was no school, were closed, Walter was a forlorn creature. He would run about the streets like an animal that had strayed from its accustomed haunts. It was the memory of Walter and his mother that had caused Hilda to flee to New York as soon as she realized her condition. All through the fevered, sleepless nights of the long winter, Hilda had been resolved not to let a fate like that of Pearl Whitney overtake her. She had determined to recover from her condition, no matter at what price, to reach the new horizons which Raymond had disclosed before her and which she had set her heart upon. But all these beautiful dreams were snuffed out now. She had deliberately snuffed them out. Like Pearl Whitney, she was now a mother. Like Pearl, she would be up and on her way to work long before 7 every morning. Like Pearl, she would age soon. Her face would become drawn. She would become listless and indifferent to life. When Hilda woke in the morning, the sun was streaming into the room, and the thought of Pearl Whitney was faint and watery. There was no comparison between them. Could be no comparison. She was in New York. A city of 4 millions was not to be compared to Stillwell with its 18,000 inhabitants. Work she would, and suffer she would, but the badge which Pearl Whitney had worn she would not wear. And her boy would not be a Walter. She would see to it. There were thousands of orphans in New York, thousands of widows. No one should ask her to prove the death of her husband. No one should ask her son to do so. Her fear of New York was gone. The city now seemed to her like a kindly, tolerant mother who was spreading a veil over her past, a veil that each of the city's 5 million inhabitants had helped weave.